Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about a group of old men who run a publishing company, specifically the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, to use a technical term, the members of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses are what sociologists and cult experts define as big slimy creeps. You can watch Jeffrey Jackson tell flat-out lies to the Australian Royal Commission in order to defend Watchtower's unacceptable stance on child sex abuse. You can watch Stephen Lett's plasticine face stretch, sag, and undulate as he says to 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses,
"We in no way want to be categorized with other organizations, religious and otherwise, that coerce their supporters to donate." However,
you can watch Anthony Morris III go on a tirade about his imagined gay conspiracy within the fashion industry to make men wear a different kind of pants or something. And you can watch Kenneth Cook be inexcusably, criminally boring all the time about everything.
Hi.
These guys, and they are all guys, as set forth in the rule books that they get to write, routinely use nearly every point in Hassan's bite model, as if they consult it for reference. You see all these things, and you think, naturally, that there can't be any way that these senile creepazoids actually believe the nonsense that they're peddling. It's a scam, and they're in on it. Right? I mean, how often can these guys ask for money before we start admitting that they're just in it for the money?
however,
But then you take a step back and you look at the structure of the organization and realize that if their plan is to take the money and run, they've set up something that seems to be precisely counterproductive to their best interests and longevity. We would expect a greedy, money-driven organization to encourage its members to pursue higher education, thereby ensuring that its members will have better jobs and thus more money to give its enterprise disguised as religion. But Watchtower discourages higher education, actively punishes those who seek it, and in fact pleads its members to keep their lives as simple as possible. We would expect to see an emphasis on its members getting married young, before they know any better, and to have lots of kids, given the vast majority of its converts come from those born into the religion. Again, they do the exact opposite. We would expect to see mandatory tithing so that it could at least calculate even basic operational expenses, let alone its own riches, but no, Watchtower proudly flaunts that they don't take collections and that donating is entirely voluntary, but also if you don't give us a little something, God's gonna be mad at you. But then also, there's the aforementioned flat-out lying. There's the history books that they publish of their own organization, which completely whitewash or otherwise omit the religion's rough edges and checkered past. They quote scientists out of context to give their creationist claims an air of authority. They also produce content that seems to respond very specifically to apostate, quote-unquote, criticisms. You know, the lies that they tell their members to never listen to. So, what is the deal? Are the governing body scam artists who are just really bad at being scam artists, or are they delusional believers who are simply following in the footsteps of their forefathers? Put more simply, do the members of the governing body know they're running a cult? Do they actually believe that they're God's one true organization, and they were appointed by Jesus to ride alongside him in the War of Armageddon? These, I submit, are two separate questions with two separate answers. And it's also worth disclaiming that this entire matter isn't all that important in the grand scheme of things, right? Watchtower's policies kill people, cause lasting emotional damage and psychological trauma, they tear apart families. That's what matters. Their intentions are beside the point. The damage is being done. But I do think understanding the mindset of these men can be beneficial for activist types. Is that what this channel is? The PowerPoint presentation channel? Is this activism? Is it podcastivism? Basically, if we know how they think and why they think the things they think, it can help us to better deconstruct their bullshit for the benefit of helping victims of said bullshit. So, question 1. Do the governing body actually believe all this noise? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are a Jehovah's Witness. You've been in the religion for decades, maybe even since birth, and for the past few years of your service to God's one true organization, you've been living at Bethel, the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses, which you have been told for possibly your entire life is the epicenter of Almighty God's earthly organization. Now, Bethel is insulated, let's call it. It's an environment where you are surrounded almost 24/7 by other true believers, where every morning you are privileged to a special worship service that only Bethelites receive, where nearly every meal you eat is free, where you don't have to pay rent, and your day job, it may be scrubbing toilets or hanging drywall, but you're doing it for God. Him, damn it. Those are God's toilets, God's drywall. You have limited access to outside information. But if this fact even occurs to you at all, would you care? You're busy. You'd barely have time to look up outside information, even if you wanted to, and you don't. You don't need to know what's going on in Satan's world. You make close friendships with people from all over the country who, like you, have dedicated their lives to selflessly giving their best years to their grand creator. When you go home to visit family, you're treated like something of a celebrity. After all, you're one of the chosen few to live at God's house. Sure, in your younger days, you had to deal with the oft-crippling sexual repression, and you learned very quickly that God's organization is full of imperfect people. But hey, Jehovah has always used imperfect people to do his holy work. That's what you've been told multiple times a week for your entire life anyway, and you've come to terms with that. You're lucky enough to be straight, so you were able to get married and pretend like you never masturbated and still don't, definitely not in the bathroom after certain judicial meetings. You're an elder. You're busy with theocratic assignments. You have tons of friends. You have a relatively happy marriage. You have 0 bills, 0 debt. So, what exactly at this point is your incentive to question your belief system? Watchtower's secret sauce, in many ways, is not its exhausting flood of propaganda and indoctrination, but the way it gradually teaches its members to self-indoctrinate. You're told to make the truth your own. You're told to do research in our pre-approved library of books our guys wrote, of course, to prove to yourself and keep testing your faith. When you reach out for a privilege of service, that's a choice you firmly believe that you made, accomplishing a goal that you yourself set and worked for. When you get baptized, you're the one who put in the work, studied those books, started going to meetings, shaved your beard, took out your unconventional by 1950s standards piercings, and conquered your smoking habit or whatever. You believe, put on the new personality, and this is why cults like Watchtower work. You don't realize you're being brainwashed because from the outset, they're teaching you to brainwash yourself. In Bethel, that level of external indoctrination and self-indoctrination is being given in lethally concentrated doses all day, every day. If you've ever been in a cult and you've believed it, you really believed it, and anybody who actively tried to shake your faith only proved to you that you do have the truth, that the world is run by the all-evil Satan, or the deep state, or the Illuminati, or whatever. The guys who end up becoming governing body members are no exception. The further up the corporate ladder they go, they, by necessity, have to believe it even harder. Every member of the governing body has gone through this process. They've studied for months or years to get baptized. They've carried microphones and adjusted sound equipment until they qualified to be ministerial servants, before they qualified to be elders, before they qualified for the circuit work, and so on. And in addition to the myriad rules and regulations that define every witness's life, every governing body member has to have a whole other level of indoctrination on top of it. They have to be anointed. As a good old meat and potatoes Jehovah's Witness, you're allowed to have lapses in faith every once in a while. Your service hours can dip. You can become inactive for a few months and still rebound, get back in. Witnesses who claim to be one of the anointed, they get none of this slack. They must believe with absolute certainty that they are one of a microscopic selection of human beings who have ever lived who get to go to heaven. Moses didn't get to go to heaven. Noah didn't get to go to heaven. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't get to go to heaven. But you out of all the billions of people who have ever lived and died, were picked by Jesus Christ to sit at his right hand and help lead the charge as he marches you into the greatest act of genocide in human history. Increasingly, Watchtower is insisting that true anointed ones... Brief aside, ones. They say ones a lot. Anointed ones, young ones, inactive ones. This is not how people talk. Stop it. Increasingly, Watchtower is insisting that true anointed ones have never questioned whether or not they are anointed. In fact, the mere act of questioning would disqualify you altogether. The January 2020 Watchtower stated, "In fact, if you are wondering whether you have been anointed by Holy Spirit, such doubt in itself would mean that you have not been. Those called by Jehovah do not wonder whether they have been anointed or not. They know." So if you're the kind of person who not only buys all of Watchtower's regular dogma, but also unquestioningly believes, nay, knows that you are one of the few chosen people in all of human history who get to ride heaven horses with Super Jesus, I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that you're a narcissist. You're a narcissist who has been trained, possibly since birth, to never question your faith, to never believe anything negative you hear about your religion. Oh, and you're relatively uneducated and have had your reasoning ability molded by narrow-minded cult leaders. Oh, and your religion pays your bills. Yes, the governing body are just a bunch of old dudes in New York. But they're not just any old dudes in New York. They are narcissistic, brainwashed, and on the company payroll. They believe this stuff. They've believed it for decades. And they have a subconscious incentive to never not believe it. Now, certainly, we can expect that things will have changed since 1983, when former governing body member Raymond Franz published his tell-all autobiography, Crisis of Conscience. The book was full of internal, secret Watchtower documents, notes from private governing body meetings, and so on. Any new appointees to the body are likely forced to sign non-disclosure agreements and all manner of legally binding paperwork. However, given the sheer entrenchment of indoctrination at that level in the Watchtower Society, it is farcical to imagine a scenario where a new governing body member, upon accepting his invitation to the highest possible position for a Jehovah's Witness by the men who he has respected for the majority of his life, is suddenly taken aside and told by these men in hushed tones, "By the way, this is all a scam, we're just making this stuff up as we go along." If you think your rank-and-file witness grandmother loses her cool upon hearing criticism of the governing body, how do you think a career anointed Bethelite would react? Is it possible that at some point, after some time serving, certain governing body members begin to suspect that they're maybe, sorta, definitely not really being guided by God's Spirit? That this is a human-run, corporatized religion like so many thousands of others? Sure, it's happened at least once before. But by that point, now, in 2020, with their faces being constantly plastered on 8 million televisions worldwide in HD, with their ridiculous rhetoric being dunked on by talk show hosts, with, the internet generally, leaving would be a scandal. Ray Franz's ouster from Watchtower was covered in Time magazine in the early 80s. His book was just that, a book, with a very niche audience and little to no marketing behind it. Now, in the year of our Lord 2020, imagine the sheer level of deserved humiliation and embarrassment that would go along with one of these guys stepping down from one of the most litigious organizations on the planet. Imagine the lawsuits which any one of these guys stepping down will be unable to afford. These are some old bitches. Most of them are well past retirement age. Every friend they have, every person they hold dear in their lives, is one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Who wants to apply for Social Security, Medicare, and find themselves at the age of 70? Why not just ride this train out? Realistically, though, most members of the governing body never reach that level of clarity. If these thoughts occur, they likely do so on a purely subconscious level. Because, lest we forget, indoctrination is a defense mechanism against critical thinking. And when you've spent your entire life teaching your brain to reason within very specific confines, and to reject anything outside of those confines, it's unlikely that your brain will magically begin to change for the better at the age of 50, 60, or 70. When I was an active Jehovah's Witness and I was told that anyone who criticized the organization was being influenced by Satan, I believed it. We all believed it. And the governing body have an infinitely greater incentive to embrace their indoctrination instead of examining it critically. Question 2, do the governing body know they're running a cult? So as I broke down in detail in my Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult and here's why video, the writers of the jw.org frequently ask questions article skillfully avoid discussions of how experts define the word, dismissing the word cult as something that means different things to different people. Instead, the article examines 2 common perceptions regarding cults and why Jehovah's Witnesses do not fit those perceptions. Again, to repeat myself, this would be like if you asked your friend if he was a criminal, and he responded by saying, well, the term criminal means different things to different people, but, consider 2 common perceptions regarding criminals and why those perceptions don't apply to me. That doesn't sound like something an innocent person would say. And this is not new light, by the way. This is not a new form of reasoning. A 1994 Watchtower had a series of articles dedicated to refuting accusations of being a cult. Jesus Christ was accused of being a drunkard, a glutton, a Sabbath breaker, a false witness, a blasphemer of God, and a messenger of Satan. He was also accused of being subversive. After Jesus' death and resurrection, his disciples were likewise the target of serious accusations. Paul was later accused of being a pestilent fellow and stirring up seditions among all the Jews throughout the inhabited earth, and of trying to profane the temple. Evidently, this new group established by Jesus Christ was considered by some to be a religious group with radical views and practices that clashed with what was accepted in those days as normal social behavior. Undoubtedly, many today would have considered the Christians a destructive cult. The accusers were often prominent and respected members of the community, and this seems to have added weight to the allegations. Many believed the accusations against Jesus and his disciples. Yet, as you probably know, every one of these charges was false. The fact that people said these things did not make them true. So the only reason why Watchtower would be this evasive is if they knew they had something to evade, and given the minimal research needed to find cult frameworks like the bite model, I think it's safe to assume that Watchtower is well aware that they absolutely fit the mold. Here's the thing, though. Cult experts are, experts, and Watchtower only trusts experts insofar as they have something to say that reaffirms their existing beliefs. It's not difficult to imagine a governing body member having the mindset that Satan himself put these experts, quote-unquote, in his wicked system of things to make Jehovah's Witnesses look bad. For a cult member, no conspiracy is too ridiculous if it keeps self-reflection at bay. And remember, these governing body members all grew up, or spent the majority of their life anyway, as Jehovah's Witnesses, being constantly indoctrinated, just like every other member. So from their perspective, assuming they believe their own doctrine still, they're merely following the example set forth in the Bible, as they see it. Wouldn't it be just like that rascally devil if Satan's world happens to define true worship as a cult? So suffice it to say, the governing body is more than aware that their organization is considered to be a cult in the eyes of the world. That's why they have to pretend that the word cult is subjective, its definition unknowable. But just because they know they're a cult doesn't mean they think they're wrong. The governing body is not sitting in their ivory tower, twirling their mustaches, thinking of ways to manipulate its followers. The bite model outlines an inevitability of all cults. It is not that leaders will consciously, nefariously conform to these tactics. It's that in order to maintain control, they must inevitably adopt these tactics. Does the governing body think that disfellowshipping is actually a biblical arrangement? Yeah, probably. Does it also just so happen to work in their favor, silencing unbelievers and critics and shaming sinners into returning? Also, yes. What I'm trying to say is, the governing body is aware of the tactics it's using, but they also believe they must use these tactics to keep people faithful to what they view is the best religion on the planet. When you start from the assumption that you have the one true religion, the one and only means of salvation, there is no policy too extreme to keep that religion protected.
But it's a huge mistake to theorize before one has data. Inevitably, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts.
This, I submit, also applies to the research put into Watchtower publications. The blatant misquotes and manipulation of data and information would seem to be a pretty outwardly nefarious thing that the governing body and the research and writing department is doing, but I would argue that they think they are doing good research. Again, they already believe they know what the truth is. If they find data that contradicts what they believe to be the truth, they don't assume that they need to reevaluate their truth, they just assume that the data is bad. This is illustrated really well in an excellent interview that XJW Fifth did with a former Watchtower writer and researcher named Ben. And in this video, as a researcher, Ben admits that the training that they get for how to do research is really just training in confirmation bias.
This is where I learned, looking back now from my perspective, just how poor the society's academic credibility is, in a sense. So at the time, I was very impressed by the thoroughness of how we did things. So even just for a couple of pages in a magazine, we would send in a very thick binder of all the photocopied articles that we'd researched and that we were quoting from, and it all looked very thorough and academic. But looking back now, I can see it wasn't, because what we were actually guilty of doing was just basically using confirmation bias all the time. So to give you an example, instead of let's say we were looking at a particular issue and writing about a particular issue, instead of researching and finding out, okay, what are all the experts saying about this issue, for or against, what are both sides of the story, we had our particular angle that we wanted to present, and we were just looking to basically quote mine. So we're looking for a quote that would support our position, and pretty much just ignoring everything else that didn't support our position. So that's basically what I did as a researcher. I was basically quote mining. I was looking for something that I could use to support my argument.
I feel like I should just clarify again that I am not trying to defend the governing body in any way, shape, or form. They're really bad. They suck. They are cult leaders. They're manipulators. Whether they're conscious of how manipulative they're being is beside the point. But I think it is a little naive to paint them as mustache-twirling villains who are actively trying to trick people. To sum it up, I think Raymond Franz said it best, as he always did. Paul Grundy, who founded jwfacts.com, wrote a letter to Ray Franz that he published on the website. And basically this was back when Jeffrey Jackson had just joined the governing body. Evidently, Paul Grundy knew Jeffrey Jackson from back in the day and asked Ray Franz, hey, what if this guy's cool? Is it possible that he could enact some positive changes in the organization? And Raymond Franz wrote this incredibly detailed and wonderful letter, a couple parts of which I think really apply to this particular topic. He starts by talking about how little the governing body seems to know or care about what the Bible actually says, and some interesting things come to light here. I had expected to witness meetings where God's word played a major part, but it seemed rarely to come into the picture. The same was true with conducting of the morning discussions at the breakfast table, chair manned on a weekly basis by a governing body member. With the great majority, their concluding comments were merely a repetition of Watchtower material with very little original thought or research. Very few of them are true students of the scriptures. Virtually none are scholars. Perhaps one overriding concern as regards any expression that does not hold to the party line stems from fear, for they must realize, even subconsciously, that their position is weak on many issues. Even here, however, I think that many believe that they are acting to protect the only good religion left on earth. As to their sincerity, then, it is, I believe, as to their belief that they are serving God, and their belief that the organization they head is superior to all other religious organizations on the face of the earth. In the latter case, I believe they can hold that belief only by being in a state of denial, not allowing themselves to face the reality of the organization's flawed course and seriously flawed record. Whatever their sincerity and their desire to serve God, it has not protected them from a remarkable insensitivity to the disillusioning effect of their failed apocalyptic predictions on the membership, the weakening effect it has on their confidence in the reliability and worth of the scriptures. I doubt that the reason for the secretive and authoritarian nature of the organization's leadership can be reduced down to any one or two factors. Knowing the men, I have no question that some, such as John Booth, George Gangas, and others, simply believed, somewhat blindly, that the organization is God's sole channel. They seem to have no other motivation. Others manifested a degree, greater or smaller, of ambition and concern for prestige. Only a few displayed some measure of willingness to act in a harsh manner reminiscent of inquisitional times. Among the governing body members as a whole, there was not great excitement about the 1975 predictions. As shown in Crisis of Conscience, they did express a measure of concern as to the possibility of disillusionment at one meeting described, but in other respects, it was almost as if they were bystanders, watching what went on, but not feeling directly involved or responsible. This degree of detachment was not unusual and illustrate the effect of being an elite body. So, yeah, he goes on to say it's clearly not financial wealth. It's nice to have free room and board and to be able to travel. But the real thing is just power. They really believe that this stuff is true, and by serving this organization, it's given them an immense amount of power that you'd have to enjoy. They were true believers who dedicated their life to serving this organization, and it paid off for them. They made it to the top. They probably think God blessed their efforts or whatever. And the power is the real thing. And I'm going to speak more extemporaneous here. I ran out of script a little while ago. What I think this organization does really well, that isn't remarked upon too often, is making sure that you feel worthless outside of the organization and making sure that you have the ability to really only feel successful and validated within the organization. Now, this really only works for the most part with men, because this is an incredibly outdated, misogynist organization who doesn't allow women in any position of authority whatsoever. If you're a man in the organization, from a very young age, you'll feel like an outcast at school when your friends are celebrating birthday parties, and you'll feel like an outcast at work when you're a little bit older. But from a young age, you're able to feel loved and respected in the congregation. You get to hold God's microphones. You get to read the Bible from the platform, and people will come up to you afterwards and tell you you did a great job. It starts off with just a really tiny little bit of power, but it feels good. I would admit that. I don't think that I'm a power-hungry person in general, but at a certain point, I realized that the only reason why I was still serving as a servant wasn't because I believed. It was because I liked feeling needed. I had all these severe doubts about the organization, but I still kept doing it because it was the only place in my life where I could feel anything resembling power. And I don't even think that I would have considered it power. We call it privileges. But privileges in the organization are all a form of power. Yes, usually those privileges involve, dirty work like cleaning toilets and filing paperwork and stuff. But it gives you a little bit of authority. And it doesn't take a lot of authority to go to somebody's head. So yeah, that is what I think about that. Thanks for listening. I started a Patreon, and I'm gonna start doing a podcast exclusive to the Patreon, where I'm thinking like, I don't know, doing like Watchtower study dunking on the Watchtower. I don't know, we'll work on the name, but something kind of weekly or bi-weekly or whatever. So give me money if you want. If not, that's chill.
However,